In the autumn of 1415, amid cold rain, deep mud, and the fading ideals of medieval chivalry, one of the most shocking battles in European history unfolded. The Battle of Agincourt was not merely a clash of armies, it was a brutal lesson in humility for a kingdom that believed itself invincible. On that narrow field in northern France, a starving, exhausted English force stood against the flower of French nobility and somehow prevailed. This battle would redefine warfare, shatter aristocratic confidence, and elevate one English king into legend, a war of claims and pride. The conflict belonged to the wider Hundred Years' War, a long struggle over the English claim to the French crown. In 1415, the English throne was held by Henry VII, a young monarch determined to revive English fortunes after decades of setbacks. He invaded France not as a raider, but as a king, asserting what he believed was his rightful inheritance. Henry's campaign began successfully with the siege of Harfleur, but victory came at a cost. Disease, especially dysentery, ravaged his army. Thousands were lost, and supplies ran thin. By the time Henry marched north toward Calais, his force had dwindled to roughly 6,000 men, many of them sick, hungry, and worn down. France, by contrast, had numbers, wealth, and confidence. French nobles saw the English army as wounded prey. They assembled a massive host, perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 strong, intent on crushing Henry and ending the invasion decisively, the field that became a trap. The two armies met near the village of Agincourt, in a narrow strip of farmland bordered by dense woods. Days of rain had soaked the freshly ploughed fields. What appeared at first to be open ground would soon become a sucking mire. The French commanders, confident in their superiority, chose to attack head-on. Their army was dominated by heavily armoured knights and men-at-arms, symbols of medieval prestige and chivalric warfare. The plan was simple: overwhelm the English line with force and honour. Henry V, however, understood his weakness and his strength. He deployed his army in a tight formation, with dismounted men-at-arms in the centre and longbowmen on both flanks. Wooden stakes were driven into the ground before the archers to protect against cavalry charges. The English longbow was not elegant. It was brutal, and it would soon turn French pride into catastrophe. The longbow changes history. As the French advanced, English archers unleashed volleys of arrows at terrifying speed. Each archer could fire 6 to 10 arrows per minute, raining death onto the approaching mass. Horses panicked, knights fell, armour dented, joints pierced, visors shattered. But the real killer was not the arrow alone, it was the mud. French knights encased in heavy armour trudged forward through thick, ankle-deep muck. Each step drained energy. Fallen men struggled to rise. Those behind pressed forward, compressing the front ranks into a suffocating crush. When the French finally reached the English line, they were exhausted and disorganized. English men-at-arms and even archers dropped their bows and joined the melee with axes, swords, and mallets. Knights were dragged down, pinned in the mud, and killed at close range. What should have been a glorious charge became a slaughter. Chivalry dies in the mud. Perhaps the most shocking moment came when Henry V ordered the execution of French prisoners. Fearing a renewed attack and lacking manpower to guard captives, he made a decision that horrified contemporaries steeped in chivalric ideals. This act symbolised the death of medieval warfare's old codes. At Agincourt, survival mattered more than honour. By the battle's end, French losses were staggering. Thousands lay dead, including dukes, counts, and some of the highest-ranking nobles in the kingdom. English casualties were minimal by comparison, perhaps only a few hundred. France had not merely lost a battle, it had lost face. Why France was humiliated. The humiliation of France at Agincourt did not stem solely from defeat. It came from expectation. The French believed numerical superiority, noble lineage, and armoured might guarantee victory. They underestimated terrain, technology, and discipline. Agincourt exposed the vulnerability of feudal armies and the illusion of aristocratic invincibility. It proved that common soldiers, archers drawn from villages and towns, could destroy the elite of Europe when properly led. For England, the victory was transformative. Henry VI became a national hero, seen as a warrior king favoured by God. For France, Agincourt deepened internal divisions and prolonged chaos. During a time already weakened by political infighting and mental illness within the royal family, a battle that echoed for centuries, Agincourt's legacy endured far beyond 1415. It accelerated the decline of heavy cavalry dominance and highlighted the rising importance of infantry and ranged weapons. It reshaped military thinking across Europe. More than that, it became a story, retold by chroniclers, immortalised by Shakespeare, and remembered as a moment when arrogance met reality. On that muddy field, beneath grey skies and falling arrows, medieval France was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Power without wisdom is fragile, and pride can be deadlier than any weapon. Agincourt was not just a victory for England. It was a turning point in the history of war itself, a quiet, brutal reminder that history does not favour those who believe they cannot lose. Now, let the heavy curtain of the present fall away, dissolving into the mist. Close your eyes. Imagine you are standing in a high stone chamber, the air thick with the scent of beeswax candles and the damp, salty chill of the River Thames drifting through a narrow window. The year is 1413, 2 years before the carnage, and the world is quiet, save for the scratching of a quill on parchment and the distant tolling of a bell. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. We find ourselves in the Palace of Westminster, where the shadows are long and the stone floors are cold enough to seep through the thickest leather soles, one of those delightful features of medieval architecture that they never mention in the brochures. A young man sits upon a wooden chair, staring into the embers of a dying fire. This is Henry of Monmouth, newly crowned King Henry V. He is 26 years old, lean and sharp-featured, with a distinct, clean-shaven intensity that separates him from the bearded elders of his court. If you look closely, in the flickering orange light of the hearth, you can see a faint, jagged scar on his face, a souvenir from the Battle of Shrewsbury years ago, where an arrow penetrated his cheek 6 inches deep, a reminder that death is never more than a few inches away, even for a prince. He is not the jovial, drinking tavern brawler that Shakespeare will later invent for the stage. Historians generally agree that while Henry had a wild youth, his transformation into a severe, pious, and obsessively disciplined king was sudden and absolute, almost as if the crown itself possessed a sobering weight. And what a crown it is! A hollow crown, as the poets say, for his claim to it is shaky. His father, Henry the Forsoorer, seized the throne by force, deposing his cousin Richard II. This makes Henry V the son of a usurper, a king who must constantly look over his shoulder. The air in the room feels heavy with this ambition. He needs a cause, something to unite his fractured, squabbling nobles, something grander than border skirmishes and tax disputes. His eyes turn toward the map unrolled on the table, toward the coastline of France. Across the narrow sea, the kingdom of France is glittering but rotting from the inside. It is the wealthiest nation in Christendom, yet it is paralyzed. The French king, Charles VI, suffers from a profound and tragic madness. In his worst episodes, he believes he is made entirely of glass and will shatter if touched, a terrifying delusion that forces him to sit motionless for hours, wrapped in thick blankets. terrified of his own fragility. While the Glass King sits frozen, his relatives, the Dukes of Burgundy and Orléans, are tearing the country apart in a vicious civil war, fighting for control like wolves over a carcass. Henry sees this. He sees the weakness. He believes, with a burning, terrifying certainty, that God has cleared the path for him to reclaim the lands of Normandy and Aquitaine, the ancient birthrights of his ancestors. There is a persistent myth that the French Dauphin sent Henry a chest of tennis balls as a mocking gift, implying he was fit only for games, not war. While likely a later invention by chroniclers to spice up the narrative, the sentiment is real enough. The French court views this English boy king as a nuisance, a fly to be swatted away. They do not see the scar on his face. They do not see the hunger in his eyes. The silence of the room is broken as Henry stands, the heavy velvet of his robe whispering against the floor. He has made his choice. He will not just ask for land, he will take it. He begins to dictate letters, demands so exorbitant he knows they will be rejected. The hand of the Princess Catherine, millions of gold crowns, the return of half of France. It is a game of chess played with kingdoms, and Henry is moving his pawns to force a war he claims he does not want, but which he desperately needs. The candles burn low, casting dancing shadows that look like armies marching on the walls. The wind howls outside, rattling the shutters, carrying with it the scent of salt and iron. The die is cast. The hungry king is ready to eat. To understand the storm that would break over Agincourt, we must first drift back through the tangled vines of history to see why the soil was already so thirsty for blood. For the war did not begin with Henry Fissy, nor did it start with a single insult, but rather with a legal argument so complex it could make a modern tax attorney weep with exhaustion. The 100 Years' War was not one continuous battle, but a sporadic, exhausting series of conflicts that had been bleeding England and France dry since 1337, a struggle rooted in the tangled family trees of Europe, where everyone was seemingly everyone else's cousin, and family reunions were less about potato salad and more about siege warfare. The core of the dispute lay in a dusty, ancient rule known as Salic law, a legal tradition of the Salian Franks which stated that a woman could not inherit the throne of France, nor could the crown pass through a woman's line. The English kings, descended from the French Princess Isabella, claimed that this law was nonsense, a convenient fiction invented to block their legitimate inheritance. Henry V, staring at his maps in the dim light of Westminster, believed with a cold, ironclad fury that the French crown was his property, stolen by a rival branch of the family, the House of Valois. But to claim it, he needed more than a legal brief. He needed a just war, a concept deeply important to the medieval mind. For a king who waged war without just cause imperiled his immortal soul, and Henry, for all his ambition, was a man terrified of God's judgment. He needed to prove that he had tried every peaceful avenue, that he was the aggrieved party, forced into violence by the stubbornness of others. And so, the game of chess began, played not with ivory pieces, but with ambassadors, bishops, and spies. And while Henry polished his moral armour in London, the Kingdom of France was unravelling across the Channel, a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions playing out in real time within the stone walls of the Hotel Saint-Paul in Paris. The French king, Charles VI, was a figure of profound sorrow, a man whose mind had fractured under the weight of his crown. We often think of medieval madness as something loud and violent, but Charles's affliction was often quiet, terrifyingly fragile. There were days he would refuse to wash or change his clothes for months, fearing that water would dissolve him, and other days where he would run through the corridors of his palace howling like a wolf, chased by terrified servants, holding blankets to catch a king who had forgotten he was human. Historians still argue about the exact nature of his illness. Some suggest paranoid schizophrenia, others porphyria, but the result was a political vacuum that sucked the entire nation into chaos. Because the king was absent, while sitting right on the throne, two rival factions of nobles circled him like sharks smelling blood in the water. The Armagnacs, led by the grand and powerful Count of Armagnac, who controlled the young Dauphin Louis, and the Burgundians, led by the cunning and ruthless John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. These two factions hated each other with a venom that far exceeded their dislike of the English. In fact, only a few years prior, John the Fearless had arranged the assassination of the Duke of Orléans in the streets of Paris, an act that had plunged France into a civil war so bitter that the gutters of the capital frequently ran red with French blood long before an English boot touched the sand. It was a kingdom at war with itself, a house divided, and Henry IV, watching from across the sea, saw the cracks in the foundation. He knew that if he struck now, France would be too busy holding its own throat to stop him. He played the factions against each other, negotiating with the Burgundians for neutrality, while sending high-ranking ambassadors to the Armagnac court in Paris with demands he knew they could not accept. Imagine the scene in the French court. The English ambassadors, stiff and formal in their wool and velvet, standing before the teenage Dauphin and the tired French council, demanding the restoration of the sweeping Angevin Empire, Normandy, Touraine, Anjou, Maine, and Aquitaine, along with the hand of Princess Catherine and a dowry of 2 million crowns. It was an offer designed to be rejected, a diplomatic slap in the face, delivered with a polite bow. The French, incredulous, offered a counter-proposal, a few territories and a smaller dowry, but Henry was not haggling for a rug in a bazaar. He was manufacturing a casus belli. When the French inevitably refused his impossible terms, Henry could turn to his own people, to his parliament and his church, and say, "See, I tried peace. They chose war." There is a fascinating scholarly debate surrounding the role of the English church in this escalation. Shakespeare, following the chronicler Holinshed, suggests that the Archbishop of Canterbury, Henry Chichele, actively encouraged the war to distract the king from a proposed bill that would have confiscated church lands to fund the crown, essentially paying Henry to go bother the French so he wouldn't bother the bishop's bank accounts. Whether this cynical manoeuvre was the primary driver or merely a convenient alignment of interests, the result was the same. The war chest was opened. Taxes were levied on wool and leather, the lifeblood of the English economy, and the great machinery of the state began to turn toward the coast. In the spring of 1415, the diplomatic veneer began to crack and fall away, revealing the steel beneath. Henry summoned his great council and announced his intention to cross the sea. The decision was a massive gamble. England was not a wealthy superpower, but a small nation on the edge of Europe, recovering from plague and internal revolt. To invade France was to walk into the lion's den, but Henry was banking on the fact that the lion was sick, confused, and fighting its own tail. The king began to pawn his own jewels, the golden collars and rubies of the crown, to pay the wages of archers and men-at-arms, a detail that feels incredibly poignant. A king literally mortgaging the trappings of his royalty to finance the proof of it. As the ambassadors travelled back and forth one last time, the roads of England began to fill with men moving south, drawn by the promise of sixpence a day for an archer and the dream of French plunder. The game of chess was nearing its end. The pawns had been pushed, the knights were mounting up, and the bishops had given their blessing. The diplomatic silence was about to be broken by the sound of saws and hammers, for the time for talking was done, and the time for the white ships had arrived. The king had his war. Now he just had to survive it. By the high summer of 1415, the port of Southampton was no longer a town. It was a hive, a chaotic, vibrating organism of wood, canvas and iron that smelled of tar, unwashed bodies, and the salty rot of the low tide. If you were to walk the docks in August of that year, the sensory overload would be staggering. The air was thick with the rhythmic hammering of shipwrights, the bleating of terrified livestock being hoisted aboard transports, and the rough, guttural dialects of men from every corner of England, Wales, and even Cheshire, all gathered for the great adventure. Henry had assembled a fleet of incredible size for the era, perhaps 1,500 vessels ranging from the king's own great ships like the Trinity Royal, monsters of the sea with towering forecastles painted in bright heraldic colours, to small, commandeered merchant cogs and fishing boats, snatched from harbours as far away as Holland to carry the army's immense baggage. This was a logistical miracle and a nightmare all at once. Imagine the sheer volume of supplies needed for 12,000 men and thousands of horses. Barrels of salted beef, mountains of dried peas, endless casks of ale, for water was often too dangerous to drink, and tens of thousands of arrows bundled in sheaves like deadly wheat. The most precious cargo, however, was the horses, destriers for the knights and rounceys for the archers, nervous beasts that had to be blindfolded and walked up creaking ramps, sensing with animal instinct that they were leaving solid ground for something unnatural. The English army that gathered there was a mirror of society itself, stratified, yet bound by a single purpose. At the top were the great magnates, the Dukes of Clarence, Gloucester and York, encased in the finest Milanese plate armour that cost more than a village would earn in a decade, followed by the knights and squires, and finally the vast bulk of the force, the archers. These were not the pristine, uniformed soldiers of modern movies. They were rough, hard-bitten men, many of them arguably mercenaries or pardoned criminals looking for a fresh start, clad in padded gambesons and armed with the longbow, a weapon that required a lifetime of training to master. A skeleton found from this era often reveals the archer's deformity, where the shoulder bones are thickened and twisted from years of drawing 100-pound bows. Their very bodies were warped by their trade. As the army prepared to embark, a dark ripple moved through the camp, a plot. Just as the wind was turning favourable, Henry discovered a conspiracy to assassinate him before he even set sail. The Southampton plot, led by his own cousin, the Earl of Cambridge, aimed to replace Henry with the Earl of March. It was a stark reminder that the hollow crown was always at risk. Henry acted with terrifying swiftness. The conspirators were seized, tried, and beheaded outside the city gates within days. There was no mercy, no lingering drama, just the sudden sharp fall of the axe. The king washed his hands of the blood, claimed God had saved him for the greater task ahead, and ordered the fleet to launch. It was a powerful message to his men. Treason brings death, but loyalty brings France. On Sunday, August 11th, 1415, the great fleet finally began to move, a forest of masts slipping out of the Solent. The sight must have been breathtaking, thousands of white sails billowing against the grey-blue sky, the king's ship leading the way, with a massive lantern on its stern to guide the armada through the night, accompanied by the squawk of gulls and the creaking of timbers. They were heading for the mouth of the Seine to a port city called Harfleur. Henry's strategy was sound on paper: capture Harfleur to secure a base of operations, much like Calais, and then march triumphantly to Paris or Bordeaux. He envisioned a disciplined, methodical conquest, but the sea has a way of humbling kings. The crossing was relatively smooth, but the landing was chaotic. They arrived at the Chef de Caux on the northern bank of the Seine estuary, a desolate, marshy place where the men had to wade ashore, holding their weapons high above the surf. There was no French army waiting for them on the beach, a massive strategic error by the French commanders, who were still arguing in Paris about who should lead the defence. This allowed Henry to unload his siege engines, his cannons and his horses without a single arrow fired at him. It felt like a divine blessing. The army set up camp outside the walls of Harfleur, a strongly fortified town that controlled the traffic of the Seine. The citizens of Harfleur, seeing the forest of English tents, sprouting like poisonous mushrooms in the fields, closed their gates, flooded the surrounding dikes to create a muddy moat, and prepared for a siege. They were not afraid. They knew that winter was coming, and they knew that the English army, no matter how large, was far from home. Henry sent a herald to the gates, demanding surrender in accordance with Deuteronomy 20, which offered mercy to those who submitted but total destruction to those who resisted. The captain of Harfleur, the brave Raoul de Gaucourt, refused, and so the guns began to speak. This was one of the first major conflicts where gunpowder artillery played a significant role alongside traditional trebuchets. The English had brought massive iron guns with names like the King's Daughter and the Messenger, which hurled stone balls smashing into the walls day and night. The noise was deafening, a thunder that never ceased, shaking the ground and the nerves of everyone for miles. But while the walls of Harfleur crumbled, something far more dangerous was brewing in the English camp. Not a counterattack, but a microorganism. The marshes around the town were stagnant and foul in the late summer heat. The soldiers, camped in the mud, drinking water tainted by sewage and the rotting shellfish of the estuary, began to fall ill. It started with stomach cramps, then fever, then the bloody flux, dysentery. It moved through the ranks faster than any French cavalry charge. Men who could draw a longbow with lethal precision were reduced to shivering, helpless heaps in their own filth. The latrine pits overflowed. The smell of the camp became the smell of death. The king's great army was rotting from the inside out before it had fought a single-pitched battle. The Bishop of Norwich died. The Earl of Suffolk died. Every morning, hundreds of bodies were dragged out of tents and buried in shallow graves. The siege dragged on for 5 weeks. 5 weeks of heat, flies, and the groans of dying men. When Harfleur finally surrendered on September 22nd, it was a hollow victory. Henry walked through the shattered gates barefoot as an act of penance, but he was now the leader of a ghost army. He had lost perhaps a third of his force to disease and desertion. The campaigning season was over. The autumn rains were beginning. His council urged him to garrison the town and sail home to England, to return next year when the army was fresh. It was the sensible, safe choice. But Henry V looked at the grey horizon, his face set like flint. He had not come this far to go home with just one town. He would not sail back like a bruised merchant. He turned to his reduced, coughing, shivering band of brothers and made a decision that defied all military logic, a gamble that would lead them directly into the mouth of hell. "We will not return," he said. "We will march to Calais." The silence that settles over a city after a siege is heavier than the noise of the bombardment itself. In the first days of October 1415, Harfleur was a broken shell, its walls gaping like toothless mouths, its streets slick with the refuse of war. The great iron guns, those king's daughters that had thundered for weeks, were finally cold. But the air inside the town remained hot, thick with the cloying sweet rot scent of unwashed bodies and festering wounds. Henry V had won his prize, but as he walked the cobbled streets of the conquered town, he must have realised that the prize was poisoned. The bloody flux, dysentery, did not respect flags or borders. It had seeped from the English camp into the town and back again, creating a biological deadlock where the victors were dying just as quickly as the vanquished. To secure the town, Henry had to purge it, a decision that sits uncomfortably in the modern mind, balancing on that razor-thin medieval line between cruelty and necessity. He ordered the expulsion of the French citizens, women, children, the elderly, and the poor who could not pay a ransom. Imagine the scene at the town gates. a long weeping procession of families carrying their entire lives in bundles on their backs, ushered out into the uncertain countryside by English soldiers who were themselves gaunt and hollow-eyed. Henry, in a gesture he likely viewed as Christian mercy, gave each exile 5 sous and ordered they not be harmed, ensuring they were sent safely toward French lines rather than slaughtered. It was gentle by the brutal standards of the age, yet it was a harsh displacement that stripped the town of its soul, leaving Harfleur a hollow fortress populated only by ghosts and a garrison of English soldiers too sick to stand. This was the reality of the glorious invasion, a depopulated ruin and a hospital ward disguised as a military camp. Inside the English council tent, the atmosphere was arguably more volatile than the siege itself. The king's brother, the Duke of Clarence, had fallen ill and was being sent home, along with thousands of others who were simply too weak to lift a sword. The army lists from this time tell a grim story. Captains who had arrived with 50 men now reported 15 fit for duty. The force had been effectively decapitated and gutted. The prudent move, the move every seasoned commander in that tent likely advocated, was to garrison Harfleur, winter in England, and return in the spring with a fresh host. To march now, with winter biting at their heels and a hostile nation waking up around them, seemed like suicide, but Henry was possessed by a singular, divine confidence. He viewed the dysentery not as a disaster, but as a test of faith, a tribulation sent by God to purify his army of the unfaithful and the weak. He would not retreat. He would perform a chevauchée, a mounted raid marching north to the English stronghold of Calais. This decision is one of the most debated moments in the campaign. Historians still argue whether Henry was acting out of supreme arrogance, tactical genius, or simply the desperate need to save face. To sail home after taking only one town would look like a defeat. To march across France, flaunting his banner in the face of the enemy, was a statement of ownership. He declared that he was merely travelling through his own Duchy of Normandy, a landlord inspecting his unruly estates. But to do this, the army had to change. They could no longer be a slow-moving siege force. They had to become a pack of wolves, lean fast and unencumbered. The order was given to strip down. This is a crucial sensory detail often missed in the grand retellings. The English army had to abandon its heavy luggage. The great siege guns, the pride of Henry's arsenal, were dragged into storage in Harfleur. Wagons laden with fine tents, extra armour, and luxury goods were left behind. Every soldier was told to carry only what he could walk with, his weapons, his armour, and 8 days of rations, dried meat, hard biscuits, and perhaps a little watered wine. The archers, the backbone of the force, carried their heavy yew-bows, a quiver of arrows, and a stake, a 6-foot wooden pole pointed at both ends. This humble piece of wood, intended to be driven into the ground to impale charging horses, would soon become more valuable than gold. The transformation was profound. The army that prepared to leave Harfleur on October 8th was not the glittering host that had left Southampton. It was a skeleton crew, numbering perhaps 6,000 or 9,000 men. Estimates vary wildly, but hardened. These were the survivors. The weak had died or gone home. Those who remained were the happy few by necessity, men whose immune systems were iron and whose loyalty to the king was absolute. Yet, even among the survivors, many were still suffering the lingering effects of the flux, marching with soiled breeches, their faces pale and waxy. There is a dark, soft humour to be found in the soldier's plight, the grumbling about the weight of the biscuits, the betting on who would collapse first, the grim jokes about French cooking being the real enemy. It grounds the epic in the human reality of blistered feet and empty bellies. As the column formed up outside the walls, the weather began to turn. The early autumn sun, which had baked the marshes during the siege, was replaced by grey, leaden clouds rolling in from the Atlantic. The smell of rain was in the air, a cold, soaking rain that would become the defining character of the weeks to follow. Henry rode at the front, not in a carriage, but on horseback, sharing the weather with his men. He wore a simple bassinet helmet and a surcoat emblazoned with the lilies of France and the leopards of England, a walking flag of defiance. The plan was deceptively simple. March 150 miles northeast to Calais. They expected to complete the journey in 8 days. They believed the French army was still scattered, paralysed by the madness of their king and the infighting of their dukes. They were wrong. Unknown to Henry, the shock of Harfleur's fall had finally slapped the French nobility awake. The glass king remained in his palace, but a great summons had gone out. The oriflamme, the sacred red war banner of St. Denis, which signalled that no quarter was to be given, was being prepared. While the English were shedding weight and licking their wounds, the French were gathering a storm. As the English rearguard marched away from the rotting walls of Harfleur, leaving the safety of stone for the exposure of the open road, they were walking into a landscape that was actively turning against them. The bridges were being broken, the fords were being guarded. The country people were hiding their grain. The departure from Harfleur was quiet. There were no trumpets, no cheers, only the rhythmic tramp of boots and hooves on the damp earth, the creak of leather, and the coughs of men trying to clear their lungs. They were walking into the unknown, guided by a king who claimed to hear the voice of God, but who was leading them into a trap of mud and steel. The city gates groaned shut behind them, sealing their fate. They were alone in enemy territory, a ribbon of reddened steel moving through a hostile green void. The siege was over. The hunt had begun. The English army moved like a coiled muscle, stretching and contracting along the winding roads of Normandy. It was a column of steel and leather, miles long, cutting through the autumnal landscape with a singular, disciplined purpose. The rhythm of the march was hypnotic. The clack, clack, clack of hooves, the tramp of thousands of boots, the jingle of harness rings, a monotonous percussion that hammered the reality of the distance into the bones of every man. They were covering roughly 15 miles a day, a punishing pace for men recovering from dysentery and weighed down by armour. Yet there was a strange, focused energy in the ranks. They were going home. Calais was the beacon, the promise of warm beds, English ale, and the safety of the Channel. But to get there, they had to behave not as conquerors, but as pilgrims of war. Henry V had issued a strict code of conduct, known as the Ordinances of War, which was revolutionary in its severity. Unlike the chevauchés of earlier decades, where English armies had burned, looted, and raped their way across France like a plague of locusts, Henry forbade plunder. He declared that no church was to be desecrated, no woman touched, no crops burned. This was not merely piety, it was politics. Henry considered himself the rightful king of France. These peasants were his subjects. You do not burn down your own house to evict a squatter. He wanted to win hearts and minds, or at least ensure that the local population didn't rise up with pitchforks to cut his supply lines. This discipline was tested early, in a moment that Shakespeare would later immortalise, though the truth is starker than the play. A soldier, hungry and perhaps foolish, stole a pyx, a small box used to hold the consecrated host, from a village church, mistaking the copper for gold. When the theft was discovered, the army halted. The silence that fell over the column was heavier than the armour. Henry did not hesitate. The man was hanged from a tree beside the road, his body left swaying in the wind as the king and the entire army marched past. It was a brutal message. God's law was the king's law. and neither would be mocked. The soldiers marched on, eyes forward, the image of the hanging man burned into their minds, a grim reminder that their greatest danger might come from their own commander. As they pushed northeast, the landscape of Normandy seemed to close in around them. The rolling hills were lush, but the villages were eerily empty, the grain stores swept clean. The French were not fighting, but they were watching. Shadowy figures, scouts, light cavalry, appeared on the ridges, observing the English column before vanishing into the woods. It was a psychological weight, the feeling of being herded rather than hunted. The French commander, the veteran Marshal Boucicaut, knew better than to attack the English head-on while they were still organised. Instead, he employed a strategy of shadow and denial. He would let the land fight the English. He would let the hunger fight them. By the fourth day, the rations carried from Harfleur began to run thin. The dried meat was gone. The biscuits were reduced to crumbs. Men began to forage for nuts, berries and raw vegetables in the fields, gnawing on turnips pulled from the cold earth. The dysentery, which had quieted, began to whisper again in the bowels of the weakened men. The 8-day march was halfway done, but the miles seemed to be stretching. And then the rain began. It wasn't a storm, not yet, but a persistent, soaking drizzle that turned the dust of the road into a slick grey paste. Woolen cloaks became heavy sponges. Bowstrings had to be unstrung and tucked into dry cases. Armour began to bloom with spots of rust. The glamour of the campaign was washing away, revealing the miserable reality of medieval logistics. The objective was the River Somme. If they could cross the Somme, Calais was within reach. Henry aimed for the ford at Blanchetaque, a legendary crossing point where his great-grandfather, Edward III, had crossed before the Battle of Crécy. It was a place of good omens. The army's spirits lifted as they approached the river valley on October 13th. They could smell the water. They could imagine the other side. But as the vanguard crested the hill overlooking the river, the hope shattered. Across the water, on the far bank of Blanchetaque, a wall of stakes bristled from the mud. Behind them stood a formidable force of French troops, their banners snapping in the wind. The ford was blocked. The good omen had been checkmated, and worse, a local prisoner revealed that the French had driven sharp stakes into the riverbed itself, hidden beneath the water, ready to impale any horse that tried to cross. Henry stared across the grey, rushing water. He was trapped. To the north lay the blocked ford. To the west, the ocean. To the south and east, the heart of France, swarming with enemies. The French plan was suddenly terrifyingly clear. They were not trying to stop him from reaching Calais. They were trying to pin him against the river and starve him into submission. They were using the Somme as an anvil, and their army was the hammer. There is a moment in every disastrous campaign where the commander must choose between pride and survival. A lesser man might have ordered a desperate suicidal charge across the ford. Henry did not. He turned his horse around. He ordered the army to march inland, upstream, away from the sea, away from Calais, deeper into enemy territory. A groan must have gone through the ranks. To walk away from safety, to march south when home was north. It was a gamble of immense proportions. Henry was betting that he could outmarch the French on the other bank, find an unguarded bridge or ford higher up the river, and cross before they could stop him. It became a foot race along the winding banks of the Somme. On the left bank, the starving English tramped through the mud. On the right bank, the well-fed French shadowed them, keeping pace, shouting insults across the water. The French soldiers would ride parallel to the English, mocking them, holding up bottles of wine and loaves of bread, taunting the goddams, a common French nickname for the English, based on their favourite curse word. The days blurred into a haze of marching and frustration. Every bridge they reached was broken. Stone arches smashed, wooden spans burned. At Pont-Remy, the bridge was gone, and a massive French force waited on the other side. At Hangest, the bridge was destroyed. The river, swollen by the rains, was too deep to swim. The English were walking into a funnel, pushing further and further south, consuming their precious time and energy. The 8 days were up. The food was gone. They were now eating whatever they could find, raw corn, hazelnuts, even grass. The discipline held, but it was brittle. Henry walked among his men, his face gaunt, but his voice steady. He joked with them, prayed with them, forbade them from showing fear. "God is with us," he would say, his eyes scanning the river for a ripple, a shallow, a mistake in the French line. But the French were making no mistakes. They were mirroring every move, a reflection in the water that refused to break. As they passed the city of Amiens, the situation became critical. They were now miles off course, deep in the interior of France. The army was essentially a moving target, cut off from supply, communication, and escape. The rumours began to spread through the ranks, whispers that the king had led them into a tomb, that they would die not by the sword, but by the slow grinding agony of starvation in this wet foreign land. But Henry V was a student of history, and he knew that the river had to break eventually. He knew that rivers, like armies, had weak points. He needed just one slip, one unguarded causeway, 1 hour of negligence from the French commanders. He pushed the men harder, marching through the night, driving them with a relentless, terrifying will. He wasn't just racing the French army anymore, he was racing the collapse of his own army's body and soul. The gamble of the long march had become a desperate sprint for survival, and the finish line was nowhere in sight. The River Somme is not a mighty, roaring torrent like the Rhine or the Danube. It is a sluggish, winding serpent of a river, meandering through the flat, chalky landscape of Picardy. In the grey light of October 1415, however, this lazy stream became a wall of iron that divided life from death. For the English army, marching south along the western bank, the river was a constant mocking companion. Every time the road curved toward the water, they would look across the reed-choked shallows and see them, the shadows. The French army was no longer a vague threat on the horizon. It was a physical mirror, moving in perfect lockstep on the eastern bank. It was a psychological torture that no chronicle can fully capture. To see your enemy, to hear their horses whinny, to watch the smoke of their campfires rise in the twilight, and yet be unable to touch them. It was a game of cat and mouse played on a grand scale where the mouse was starving and the cat was growing larger by the hour. As the English trudged past the steeples of Amiens, the great city looming like a fortress in the mist, the discipline of the march began to fray at the edges, tested by the sheer absurdity of their plight. They were walking deeper into France to get out of France. The French commanders, led by the constable Charles d'Albret and the marshal Boucicaut, were executing a strategy of suffocating patience. They held all the bridges. They guarded every ford. They didn't need to attack. They only needed to wait for the English to drop from hunger or dissolve into a rabble. The French soldiers, well-fed and confident, would ride down to the river's edge to water their horses, shouting insults across the narrow gap. They called out to the English archers, mimicking the drawing of a bow and making slicing motions across their fingers. A grim promise that if captured, the archers would lose the fingers they used to pull the string. This specific threat, the mutilation of the fingers, is often cited as the origin of the V-sign insult, 2 fingers raised, though historians debate the veracity of this legend. Myth or fact, the fear was real. The English knew they were fighting for more than a ransom. They were fighting to keep their hands. The tension exploded near the town of Corbie on October 17th. Here, the river bent sharply, bringing the two armies tantalizingly close. The French, emboldened by the proximity, launched a sudden vicious sortie from the town, charging out of the gates to slam into the English flank. It was a test of reflexes. The English archers, despite their fatigue, reacted with the instinct of drilled professionals, planting their stakes and darkening the air with arrows. In the melee that followed, a moment of pure medieval drama unfolded. A French knight managed to seize a standard belonging to the Duke of Gloucester. Before he could turn his horse, an English soldier named John Bromley charged into the press, killed the knight, and recovered the flag. It was a small victory, a skirmish rather than a battle, but it electrified the army. It proved that the French were not invincible ghosts. They bled, they fell, and they could be beaten. Henry rewarded Bromley with a lifetime annuity of $20, a fortune for a commoner, signalling to his freezing men that valour would be paid in gold, even he at the end of the world. But bravery could not build a bridge. The skirmish at Corby also brought a chilling piece of intelligence. A captured French soldier revealed that the massive army of the King of France and the Duke of Burgundy was assembling ahead, preparing to crush the English against the river. The trap was not just closing, it was about to snap. Henry realized he had to change the rules of the game. He could not simply keep marching upstream following the river's endless loops, because the river was leading him straight into the main French host. He needed to buy time. He needed to vanish. In a bold, risky manoeuvre, Henry ordered the army to turn away from the river and cut across the chord of the Somme's great bend, marching across the Santerre plain. This was dead ground, flat, open, and desolate. By cutting the corner, Henry hoped to gain a day or two on the French, who were forced to follow the longer, winding path of the riverbank. It was a forced march of punishing intensity. The English moved like spectres through the driving rain, heads down, silent. There were no drums, no trumpets, only the squelch of boots in the mud. The land here was stripped bare. The French had practiced a scorched earth policy, destroying barns and hiding food. The English were now surviving on berries, sloes, and the raw, unground wheat they found in the fields, which they rubbed between their hands to separate the kernels, a pathetic meal for men carrying 60 pounds of gear. As they marched, the shadows on the right disappeared. For a brief, terrifying day, the English were alone in the void. Where were the French? Had they fallen behind, or were they circling ahead, waiting in ambush? The silence of the Santerre plain was louder than the taunts had been. It was the silence of a held breath. The king rode up and down the line, his face a mask of calm determination, but his chaplains were praying ceaselessly. They knew the geography was against them. If they didn't find a crossing soon, they would reach the headwaters of the Somme, only to find the French army waiting for them on dry ground, fully assembled and ready to slaughter them. Then, on the 18th of October, a glimmer of hope appeared, not from a scout, but from a prisoner. Some accounts suggest a local villager, perhaps bearing a grudge against the French nobility, or simply bribed with English gold, whispered a secret to the king's officers. There were two causeways near the villages of Bethencourt and Voyenne. They were damaged, yes. The marshland around them was flooded, yes. But they were there. And most importantly, the French guard there was thin. The main French force, confident that the English were trapped further downstream, had not yet reinforced this specific, remote section of the river. Henry didn't hesitate. He ordered the army to pivot and sprint toward the river. It was a race against the sun and the enemy scouts. They arrived at the marshy banks to find a desolate scene. The causeways had been smashed, the wooden beams torn up, leaving only broken piles sticking out of the swirling black water. To cross here seemed impossible for an army with horses and armour. The gaps were too wide, the water too deep. But it was this or death. Henry looked at the broken stones and the reeds whipping in the wind. He didn't see a ruin. He saw a door. He ordered every able-bodied man, from knight to archer, to lay down his weapon and pick up a tool. They would not find a bridge. They would build one. The cat and mouse game was over. The English had stopped running. They were now frantically digging, hacking, and weaving willow branches into mats, trying to bridge the gap before the shadows returned. The air was electric with urgency. Every man knew that if the French vanguard appeared on the opposite ridge while they were halfway across, it would be a massacre. They would be caught split in two, half on one bank, half on the other, with the river serving as their grave. The hammers began to ring out against the wood, a desperate industrial rhythm in the quiet countryside. They were building a miracle out of mud and sticks, and they were doing it with the enemy's breath on their necks. The crossing of the Somme on October 19th was less a military manoeuvre and more a feat of frantic, terrifying engineering. The location was not the legendary ford of Blanchetaque near the sea. That gate had been barred shut, but a desolate stretch of marshland near Bethencourt and Voyenne, deep inland. Here the river was not a single clean stream, but a confused, boggy mess, cut by two causeways that the French had smashed in an attempt to strand the English. The water was black, swollen with autumn rain, and choked with reeds that looked like drowning fingers. It was here that Henry the Fevre demanded a miracle. The work began before dawn. The English army, usually a machine of destruction, transformed into a construction crew. Knights in rusted armour waded chest-deep into the freezing water to drive fresh piles into the mud. Archers tore down nearby cottages, not for plunder, but for wood, ripping off doors, shutters, and roof beams to lay across the treacherous gaps. They wove willow branches into hurdles and packed them with straw to create a stable surface over the sucking mud. It was a race against a clock they couldn't see. Every man worked with one ear cocked to the wind, listening for the thunder of hooves that would signal the arrival of the French main force. If the enemy caught them now, split by the river, half the army would be slaughtered on the bank, while the other half watched helplessly from the far side. Henry stood at the entry to the causeway, a solitary figure of absolute authority. He ordered the crossing to be ruthless in its discipline. One causeway was designated for the men-at-arms and archers, marching single file. The other was for the horses and the baggage. There was to be no pushing, no panic. Any man who broke the line or raised his voice would be punished. The silence of the operation was eerie. Thousands of men and beasts moving over creaking wood and splashing through freezing shallows, with hardly a sound rising above the wind. The only noise was the rush of the water and the heavy breathing of men carrying their lives on their backs. As the sun began to climb, casting a weak, watery light over the marshes, a heart-stopping sight appeared on the opposite ridge, a French scout. He sat atop his horse, a silhouette against the grey sky, watching the English pour across the makeshift bridges like ants. A ripple of terror went through the ranks. Was he alone? Was the entire French vanguard just behind the hill? The archers reached for their bows, but the distance was too great. The scout watched for a long, agonizing minute, then wheeled his horse and galloped away to raise the alarm. The secret was out. The clock had struck. "Faster!" The order passed down the line, not as a shout, but as an urgent whisper. The crossing became a blur of motion. Men slipped on the wet wood, falling into the marsh, pulled out by comrades before the mud could swallow them. The horses, sensing the anxiety of their masters, rolled their eyes and tossed their heads, their hooves clattering precariously on the slick timber. Yet, the discipline held. By the time the afternoon shadows lengthened, the rearguard scrambled up the muddy bank of the eastern side. They had done it. The entire English army, sick, starving, and exhausted, had slipped the lock. They were across the Somme. The sensation of standing on the eastern bank was a complex cocktail of relief and dread. They had escaped the trap of the river, yes, but in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. By crossing the Somme, they had placed themselves on the same side of the board as the French army. There were no more barriers between them and the enemy. The chase was effectively over. The confrontation was now inevitable. Henry knew this. He didn't celebrate. He formed the men up, checked the perimeter, and ordered the march to continue north. But the mood had shifted. The miracle of the Somme had given the men a jolt of superstitious confidence. They began to believe that perhaps the king was right, that God really was guiding them through the wilderness. Why else would the French have left this one crossing unguarded? Why else would the river have allowed them passage? It was a fragile hope, built on exhaustion and adrenaline, but it was enough to keep their legs moving. As they marched away from the river, leaving their makeshift bridges behind, the landscape changed. They were moving out of the marshlands and into the open rolling plateau of Picardy. The air was colder here, sharper, and the signs of the enemy were everywhere. They found fresh tracks of a massive army, deep ruts carved by thousands of wagons, hoof prints that turned the roads into quagmires. The French were close. In fact, the English had likely crossed behind the French vanguard, and now the two great hosts were moving on parallel tracks, separated by only a few miles of hills and woods. On October 20th, heralds from the French dukes finally arrived in the English camp. They were magnificent figures, their tabards bright with gold and azure, a stark contrast to the mud-caked, ragged English lords who received them. The message they brought was simple and chilling. The French commanders, the Dukes of Orléans and Bourbon, formally challenged Henry to battle. They did not specify a time or place, merely the intent. It was a chivalric formality, a polite way of saying, "We are going to kill you now." Henry's response was classic medieval stoicism. He did not bluster. He simply replied, "All things are in the hand of God." He told the heralds that he would not seek a battle, but nor would he run from one. He would march to Calais. If they wished to stop him, they would have to stand in his way. It was a masterclass in royal composure, but as the heralds rode away, the reality set in for every man in the camp. The game of cat and mouse had ended. The cat had stopped playing. The march continued for 3 more days, a tense, silent procession through a world that felt increasingly hostile. The rain returned heavier than before, turning the world into a grey smear. The English were now walking through the tracks of the French army, seeing the remnants of their campsites, the vast piles of refuse, the trampled fields, which gave them a sense of the sheer scale of the force they were facing. They were a small boat waking in the turbulence of a leviathan. Finally, on the 24th of October, the English scouts crested a ridge near the village of Blangy and stopped dead. Below them, filling the valley like a colourful steel flood, was the French army. It was not just an army. It was a nation in arms. Thousands of banners snapped in the wind. The forest of lances seemed to go on forever. They were blocking the road to Calais. The trap, which Henry had so deftly avoided at the river, had finally snapped shut here in the shadow of a small castle. The English column halted. The men stared down at the multitude, and the silence was absolute. There was nowhere left to walk. The road ended here, at a place the locals called Tramicourt. As the English vanguard topped the ridge overlooking the valley of the Ternois, the breath left the lungs of 6,000 men simultaneously, a collective gasp that was lost in the howling October wind. Below them, stretching from the dark eaves of the woods of Agincourt to the dense thickets of Tramicourt, lay the French host. It was a sight of terrifying beauty. A sea of steel and silk, that seemed to fill the very horizon. Historians still argue whether the French outnumbered the English by 3-1 or 6-1, but to the shivering archer on the ridge, the math didn't matter. There were simply too many. The French banners, embroidered with the lilies of France and the heraldry of 100 noble houses, whipped violently in the air, creating a kaleidoscope of gold, azure, and crimson against the leaden sky. This was the moment the long march ended. The road to Calais, once a distant hope, was now physically blocked by a wall of men and horses. Henry V, riding a small grey pony to save his warhorse's strength, looked down at the opposition with a face that betrayed nothing. He knew that his gamble at the river had succeeded in getting them across, but the speed of the French mobilization had been underestimated. They had not just caught him, they had chosen the ground. The terrain was a narrow strip of open farmland, perhaps 1,000 yards wide, flanked on either side by impenetrable forests. It was a funnel, and the French were the plug. The English army began to descend the ridge into the valley, moving with a grim, practiced silence that contrasted sharply with the boisterous energy of the French camp. You could hear the difference across the fields. The French were shouting, laughing, and betting on which English lords they would capture for ransom, while the English were listening to the wind and the sounds of their own labouring hearts. A small joke began to circulate among the English archers, a bit of gallows humour to keep the cold at bay. They whispered that the French had so many men they'd have to fight in shifts just to find a spot on the field. It was a thin laugh, but it was all they had. As the sun began to dip behind the clouds, casting long skeletal shadows across the mud, Henry ordered his army to halt and prepare for the night. They were within a mile of the enemy, so close they could see the steam rising from the French horses and hear the clatter of armour as the knights dismounted. The English position was precarious. They were trapped in a bowl of land, with the village of Maisoncelles at their backs and the massive French host in front. There would be no secret movements tonight, no more clever river crossings. The night of October 24th was to be a vigil. The rain, which had been a constant companion for weeks, now became a deluge, a relentless freezing downpour that turned the freshly ploughed fields of Agincourt into a viscous, sucking slurry. This wasn't just rain, it was the climate itself taking a side in the conflict. The soil here was a heavy, clay-rich loam that absorbed water like a sponge but refused to let it go, creating a surface that was deceptively solid on top but a trap beneath. For the English, this was a night of misery, because Henry had ordered absolute silence to prevent the French from gauging their positions. No fires were allowed in the front lines. The men sat in the dark, hunched under their wet cloaks, feeling the cold seep into their joints. The archers spent the night checking their bowstrings, keeping them tucked against their skin to keep them dry, for a wet string was a useless string. They were hungry, their stomachs cramping from weeks of nuts and raw grain, and many were still suffering the agonizing effects of dysentery. Imagine the scene, thousands of men huddled in the mud, the only sound the rhythmic patter of rain on leather, and the occasional soft clink of a weapon being sharpened. Across the field, the French camp was a different world. They were a city of light. Hundreds of campfires blazed, casting a warm orange glow that reflected off the polished plate armour of the nobility. The French lords, confident in their numbers and their cause, spent the night in a fever of anticipation. To them, the English were already defeated. The only question was who would claim the glory. There were so many high-ranking nobles present, dukes, counts, and barons, that the French command structure was a chaotic mess of egos. Everyone wanted to be in the front rank. Everyone wanted to lead the charge. This aristocratic pride, while magnificent to look at, was a hidden rot. They viewed the coming battle through the lens of a tournament, a chance to win honour and wealth through the capture of English prisoners. They didn't see a threat, they saw a harvest. Meanwhile, in the English camp, King Henry was moving through the darkness. He wasn't in a tent. He was among the men. He knew that the psychological weight of the coming dawn could break his army before a single arrow was fired. He spoke to the common soldiers in low, steady tones, reminding them that they fought for their lives and their king. There is a persistent myth, reinforced by centuries of literature, that Henry gave a grand, soaring speech this night. In reality, he likely spoke of duty, of the justness of their cause, and of the harsh reality that there was no retreat. They were a band of brothers, not because of a poetic whim, but because the geography left them no other choice. The French had the luxury of hope. The English had the clarity of desperation. As the middle of the night approached, the English began to hear a strange sound coming from the French lines, the sound of horses being moved, the muffled hoofbeats of thousands of animals. Some feared a night attack, but it was merely the French rearranging their massive cavalry. The English waited, hands on hilts, hearts hammering against ribs, but the attack never came. The French were content to wait for the morning light to display their brilliance. The silence returned deeper than before. In those long, dark hours, the history of Europe hung in the balance. If the English were destroyed here, the House of Lancaster would fall, and the map of the continent would be redrawn forever. If they survived, it would be a miracle of such proportions that it would be sung of for 1,000 years. As the first hint of grey began to bleed into the eastern sky, the rain finally softened to a mist. The fields of Agincourt were revealed, a narrow, muddy theatre of war, soon to be filled with the screams of men and the whistle of arrows. The night of the vigil was over. The day of St. Crispin had arrived. The dawn of October 25th did not break with a golden flourish. It arrived as a slow, agonizing bruise of purple and grey, pulling the world out of the shadows of a restless night. The rain had finally tapered off into a fine, ghostly mist that clung to the sodden earth, making the valley feel smaller, more intimate, and infinitely more dangerous. As the light grew, the two armies truly saw each other for the first time in their full, terrifying scale. The English, having spent the night in a silence so absolute that the French supposedly thought they had deserted, began to stand. They rose from the mud like spirits, their limbs stiff with cold, their breath blooming in the autumn air. To the French eyes across the field, the English force must have looked pathetic. A thin, ragged line of men with rusted armour and hollow cheeks standing in a sea of grey muck. But there was a quiet, rhythmic clicking sound starting to rise from the English side, the sound of thousands of archers unstringing their bows from their protective cases and testing the tension of the yew. The atmosphere in the English camp was one of sombre, spiritual preparation. Henry IV, true to his meticulous nature, had ordered 3 masses to be heard. He stood before his men, not in a tent, but in the open air, wearing a surcoat emblazoned with the lions of England and the lilies of France, his crown shimmering atop his bassinet helmet. He was a visual anchor for his men. Historians still argue whether his famous St. Crispin's Day speech was as poetic as the version we know today, but the core of his message was recorded. He told his men that he would either win today as their king or die as their king, but he would never be taken for ransom. This was a vital distinction. The nobles could be captured and brought back. The common archers would simply be slaughtered. By pledging his life to the field, Henry tied his fate to the lowest soldier in his ranks. It was a masterclass in leadership, a way of turning a desperate situation into a shared, sacred duty. He also reminded them of the French threat to cut the fingers from the hands of any archer captured, a grim piece of psychological warfare that ensured every man knew that his only path home lay through the French army. Across the field, roughly 1,000 yards away, the French camp was a chaotic symphony of colour and sound. If the English were a monk's prayer, the French were a carnival. Thousands of knights, the elite of the European nobility, were struggling to find their places in the front rank. The French command was a nightmare of overlapping authorities. The Constable d'Albret and Marshal Boucicaut, the professional soldiers, wanted to wait for the English to attack, but the great dukes, Orléans, Bourbon, Alençon, were impatient. They viewed the English as a wounded animal that needed to be put down before it could escape. The French were so confident that they hadn't even bothered to deploy their own archers and crossbowmen effectively. They were shoved to the back, behind the glittering wall of knights who didn't want commoners stealing their glory. There is a soft bit of humour in the fact that the French nobility was so crowded that many knights couldn't even lower their visors or raise their lances without hitting a cousin. The geography of the field was the silent protagonist of the morning. It was a freshly ploughed strip of land, roughly 750 yards wide, flanked by the dense, tangled woods of Agincourt and Tramecourt. For the English, the woods provided a natural defence against being flanked. For the French, the woods were a cage. They had nearly 20,000 men trying to squeeze into a space that could comfortably hold perhaps 5,000. As they sat on their heavy war horses, the sheer weight of the men and animals began to press into the rain-soaked soil. Every time a horse shifted its weight, it sank inches deep into the clay. The field was not just mud. It was a liquid trap, a slurry of earth and water that had the consistency of wet cement. The French, however, were blinded by their own magnificence. They saw only the thin English line and the glory that awaited them. Hours passed in a tense, vibrating stalemate. The sun climbed higher, but neither side moved. Henry knew that every hour he waited, his men grew hungrier and weaker. He needed the French to attack, but the French were waiting for him. Finally, around 11 o'clock, Henry made a move that defied medieval military convention. He decided to provoke the giant. He ordered his army to advance banners. This meant the English had to pull up their protective stakes, walk forward through the mud, and replant them within bowshot of the French. It was a moment of extreme vulnerability. If the French cavalry had charged then, the English would have been caught in the open, disorganized and defenseless. But the French, perhaps stunned by the audacity of the move, simply watched. The English moved forward with a slow, disciplined tread, the archers carrying their heavy wooden stakes over their shoulders. They stopped just 250 yards from the French line, well within the lethal range of the longbow. The archers hammered their stakes into the ground at an angle, creating a bristling fence of sharpened wood aimed at the chests of charging horses. Then they reached into their quivers. The silence of the morning was about to be shattered. Henry gave the signal, "Now strike." A single trumpet blast cut through the mist. Thousands of archers stepped forward, drew their strings to their ears, and released. The sound was not a bang, but a terrifying collective hiss, the sound of 5,000 arrows taking flight at once, a dark, feathered cloud that blotted out the pale sun. The sky of You had arrived, and the world of the French nobility was about to collapse into the mud. The air at Agincourt did not merely grow cold, it grew heavy with the weight of impending physics. As the English archers completed their daring advance, planting their stakes a mere stone's throw from the French front, a singular, vibrating tension held the valley in a grip of iron. The French commanders, who had spent hours debating the etiquette of the charge, were suddenly faced with the impossible. The goddams were not waiting to be slaughtered. They were initiating the conversation. When the first volley of arrows left the strings, it created a sound that chroniclers of the time struggled to describe, a low, melodic hum that rapidly escalated into a shriek as thousands of goose-feathered shafts tore through the damp air. This was the opening note of a symphony that would play for 3 hours, a sound of wood and wind that signalled the end of an era. The French reaction was a mixture of outrage and instinct. For a knight of the blood royal to be pelted with missiles by a commoner was not just a military threat. It was a profound social insult. The first line of French cavalry, numbering about 1,200 elite horsemen, did not wait for a coordinated signal. Stung by the arrows that were now clattering against their steel plates like a hail of iron, they spurred their massive destriers into a gallop. But this was not the thunderous, ground-shaking charge of legend. Because of the rain-soaked, freshly ploughed earth, the horses' hooves did not strike the ground. They sank into it. The charge was a slow, agonizing struggle through a sea of liquid clay. With every stride, the horses' bellies dropped closer to the mud, their muscles straining against the suction of the earth. As the cavalry laboured forward, the English archers did not stop. They were masters of the fast shooting technique, able to keep 10 to 12 arrows in the air at any given moment. This was not targeted fire so much as a saturated bombardment. The arrows did not always pierce the high-quality steel of the knight's breastplates, but they didn't have to. A longbow arrow striking a visor at 100 feet could snap a man's neck or pierce the eye slits. More importantly, the horses were not as well armoured as their riders. The shafts bit into the flanks and chests of the animals, causing them to rear, stumble, and bolt in terror. The once ordered line of French chivalry began to fracture before it even reached the English stakes. Panicked horses, maddened by pain and the whistling of the grey goosewing, turned and fled back into their own advancing infantry, trampling the very men who were coming up to support them. Then came the mud. Historians still argue whether the mud was the primary factor in the French defeat, but to the men on the ground it was a living enemy. As the first wave of French men-at-arms followed the cavalry on foot, they found themselves walking into a churned-up graveyard of liquid soil. Each step required a massive expenditure of energy. Encased in 60 to 80 pounds of steel armour, the French knights were essentially heavy pistons trying to operate in a vat of molasses. By the time they reached the English line, they were not the terrifying warriors of the morning. They were exhausted, gasping men, their visors clogged with mud, their lungs burning for air that was restricted by the very helmets designed to protect them. They weren't just fighting the English, they were fighting the gravity of France itself. When the two lines finally met, the sound was not the clash of swords, but the dull, sickening thud of metal hitting meat and wood. The French were so tightly packed into the narrow funnel of the field that many could not even raise their arms to strike. Those in the front were pushed forward by the thousands behind them, literally shoved onto the points of the English poleaxes and the sharpened stakes of the archers. It became a crush of the heart, a claustrophobic nightmare where men died not from wounds but from suffocation, pinned upright by the mass of their own comrades. The English men-at-arms, standing on firmer ground and better spaced, began the grim work of the harvest. Henry the Fife was in the thick of it. He did not watch from a distance. He was a spinning whirlwind of heraldry in the centre of the fray. His crown was struck, a fleuret of gold sheared off by a French battle-axe, and his younger brother, the Duke of Gloucester, was wounded and knocked to the ground. In a display of the warrior king ideal, Henry stood over his fallen brother, defending him against a swarm of French attackers until he could be carried to safety. This was the emotional core of the battle, a king who bled with his men, a king whose armour was dented by the same steel as theirs. It was a stark contrast to the French leadership, which was scattered, uncoordinated, and increasingly desperate as the flower of France began to wilt in the Picardy muck. There is a dark, soft humour in the accounts of the archers during this phase. Having run out of arrows, these common men did not retreat. They drew their heavy, lead-weighted mallets, tools meant for driving stakes, and their short swords and hatchets. They were unencumbered by heavy plate armour, wearing only light leather jackets and felt hats. While the French knights struggled to lift their heavy limbs in the mud, the English archers skipped around them like deadly wood sprites, tripping them, dragging them down by their visors, and finding the gaps in their armour with narrow daggers. It was a reversal of the social order, the high-born lord, immobile and helpless in his expensive steel, being dispatched by a village boy with a hammer. Chivalry wasn't just being defeated, it was being dismantled by the very people it was supposed to rule. As the first French line collapsed, the second line was already pushing forward, only to trip over the piles of their own dead and dying. The mounds of bodies grew so high, some accounts say they were the height of a man, that the English had to climb atop the corpses to continue the fight. The field of Agincourt had become a charnel house, a place where the air was thick with the smell of iron, sweat, and the unique copper scent of blood spilled in the rain. The sun, which had briefly threatened to break through, remained hidden, as if refusing to witness the slaughter. The pride of France was being ground into the earth, and the King of England, his face splattered with the mud of his rightful kingdom, watched as the impossible began to look like a certainty. The middle of the battle was a place where time did not flow. It curdled. As the second French division, a massive wall of several thousand men-at-arms, trudged into the fray, they found the narrow battlefield had become a grotesque obstacle course. The French were no longer fighting an army so much as they were fighting a landscape of their own making. The piles of fallen men and horses, some still screaming and thrashing in the slurry, acted as a physical barrier. Historians still argue whether the French press was the true architect of their destruction, as those in the rear ranks, unable to see the slaughter at the front, continued to push forward with patriotic fervour, effectively shoving their own frontline comrades into the English blades. It was a human avalanche in slow motion. The English, by contrast, had more room to breathe, their lines thinner but more mobile, allowing them to step back, reset, and strike with terrifying precision. In this claustrophobic chaos, the English archers performed a feat that defied every rule of the medieval social contract. Seeing that their arrows were spent or ineffective against the thickest plate at such close quarters, they dropped their bows. These men, whom the French nobility viewed as little more than bothersome peasants, drew their sidearms, heavy lead-weighted mallets used for the stakes, short-handled axes and misericords, long thin daggers designed to slip through the joints of armour. Because the archers were lightly clad in linen or leather gambesons, and often went barefoot or in light shoes to gain better traction in the mud, they were vastly more agile than the French knights. They swarmed the immobile, exhausted nobles like a tide of shadows, darting in to hamstring horses or to prise, open a visor, and deliver a killing blow to the misericord, the heart. It was a visceral, terrifying subversion of power. The sound of the melee was a dull, rhythmic thudding, the sound of wood and iron meeting steel plates that had been hammered into the shapes of the men inside them. To a knight encased in armour, the experience was one of sensory deprivation and mounting panic. Your vision was reduced to two thin slits. Your hearing was a cacophony of metal-on-metal ringing. Your breath was hot, recycled, and increasingly scarce. When a knight fell in that mud, he was often unable to rise due to the weight of his gear and the suction of the clay. Many French nobles died at Agincourt without a single wound on their bodies. They simply drowned in the earth or were smothered by the weight of 3 or 4 other men falling on top of them. It was a gentle death, only in the most horrific sense of the word, a slow, silent extinguishing in the dark. Amidst this, Henry the Fife was the eye of the storm. He was recognizable to everyone by the shimmering gold crown encircling his helmet, a beacon that drew the most desperate French attacks. A group of 18 French knights, led by the Seigneur de Croisilles, had reportedly taken a solemn oath to strike the crown from Henry's head or die trying. They fought their way through the English line with suicidal bravery. In the ensuing clash, every one of them was cut down, but not before one of them managed to swing a battle axe with such force that it sheared a decorative fleur-de-lis right off the king's crown and dented his steel bassinet. Henry didn't flinch. He was a king who had spent his youth in the Welsh marches, accustomed to the gritty, unglamorous reality of hand-to-hand combat. He was not a distant commander. He was a participant in the bloodletting. The English men-at-arms, the social equals of the French knights, fought with a grim, defensive discipline. They knew that if they broke, the archers behind them would be slaughtered, and the king would be lost. There was a moment of soft, dark humour found in the chronicles where an English knight, Sir Dafydd Gam, was sent to scout the French numbers before the battle. He famously told Henry there were enough to kill, enough to take prisoner, and enough to run away. Now, in the heat of the fight, that bravado was being paid for in sweat and iron. The English were outnumbered, but they were fighting for a king they could see on a field that favoured the desperate. Every French attempt to widen the front was pinched back by the woods, forcing the mass of men into a tighter and tighter knot. As the second hour of the battle waned, the French second line began to break. It wasn't a sudden retreat, but a slow, crumbling disintegration. The men in the back, seeing the horrific piles of bodies and the exhaustion of their leaders, began to melt away into the trees. But the horror was not over. The French third line, a massive body of cavalry still mostly intact, sat on their horses at the far end of the field, watching. They were the last hope for France, but they were paralysed by the sight of their betters lying in the mud. The English, sensing victory, began to take prisoners. Hundreds of high-ranking nobles who surrendered by handing over their gauntlets, hoping for the safety of a ransom. The field was covered in these living trophies, huddled together in the English rear. Then a sudden alarm rose from the English baggage train. A local French lord, Battle d'Agincourt, had led a small force of peasants and a few men-at-arms around the woods to attack the English rear. They weren't an army, but a raiding party, and they began to pillage the king's tents, even stealing one of Henry's spare crowns. In the heat of the moment, Henry heard the shouting from behind and saw the French third line ahead beginning to stir. He faced a terrifying tactical dilemma. He had more prisoners than he had soldiers to guard them. If the French third line charged while the prisoners rose up in the rear, the English would be crushed in a pincer. It was here, in the cold light of survival, that Henry made the decision that would haunt his legacy. He gave the order, kill the prisoners. It was an order that horrified his own knights, not out of pity, but because a dead prisoner paid no ransom. When the knights hesitated to throw away their fortunes, Henry assigned a task force of 200 archers to do the work. It was a cold, systematic execution, a dark stain on the chivalric legend of the day. Thousands of the highest nobility of France were put to the sword while their hands were bound. It was a brutal reminder that Agincourt was not a tournament, it was a war of extinction. The French third line, seeing the fate of their comrades and the unwavering resolve of the English king, lost their nerve. Instead of charging, they turned their horses and rode away into the mist, leaving the field to the dead and the goddams. The air that settled over the field as the slaughter of the prisoners slowed was a thick, cloying thing, heavy with the scent of copper and the low, collective groan of a dying army. The decision to execute the captives, men who had surrendered their swords and their honour in exchange for the promise of life, is the sharpest thorn in the side of Henry IV's historical reputation. Historians still argue whether this was a calculated necessity of war or a moment of cold-blooded panic. From the king's perspective, the logic was as brittle as the ice on the puddles. He had perhaps 6,000 men, half of whom were exhausted, and he was guarding nearly 3,000 prisoners while a fresh French third line loomed on the horizon. A single shout of rebellion from the captives could have turned his victory into a massacre, yet even in the brutal 15th century, this act sent a shiver through the English ranks. To kill a man in the heat of a melee was war. To kill him while he sat bound in the mud was something else entirely. It was the moment the medieval world's romantic mask slipped, revealing the industrial face of survival. The French third line, however, did not charge. Seeing the horrific piles of their countrymen and the uncompromising ruthlessness of the English king, the remaining French cavalry melted away into the surrounding forests like ghosts retreating from the sun. The great flower of France had not just been plucked, it had been stomped into the clay. As the realization of victory finally began to ripple through the English line, the adrenaline that had sustained them for hours began to drain away, replaced by a crushing, bone-deep fatigue. Archers, who had been nimble wood sprites minutes ago, now leaned on their bows, their hands shaking, their faces smeared with a mask of soot, sweat, and the red spray of the melee. They looked around at a world that had been transformed. The green and brown farmland of the morning was now a patchwork of steel, colourful silk surcoats, and the pale waxy skin of the fallen. Henry V, his armour dented and his surcoat torn, rode slowly across the field, his horse stepping carefully between the bodies. He called for the French herald, Montjoie, who had watched the battle from a distance. In a moment of quiet, dramatic tension, Henry asked the herald to whom the victory belonged. Montjoie, bowed by the weight of the catastrophe, replied, "To you, sire." Henry then asked the name of the nearby castle, whose stone towers peeked through the thinning mist. "Agincourt," the herald replied. "Then let this be called the Battle of Agincourt," Henry declared, formalizing the carnage into history. There is a soft, weary humour in the thought of a king needing to ask where he was after spending 3 hours fighting for his life there. But in the medieval mind, naming the place was an act of possession. The disparity in the body count was the most shocking truth of the day. While numbers from this era are notoriously exaggerated, the reality was staggering. The English had lost perhaps a few hundred men, among them the Duke of York, who had reportedly suffocated in his own armour after being knocked down, and the young Earl of Suffolk. The French, however, had lost the very heart of their nation. 3 dukes, 8 counts, and over 90 barons lay dead in the mud. In total, nearly 6,000 Frenchmen had perished, including the Constable of France himself. An entire generation of leadership had been wiped out in a single afternoon. The social structure of France had been decapitated, leaving the kingdom in a state of political paralysis that would last for years. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting long, bloody-coloured light across the valley, the English began the grim task of clearing the field. They were looking for their own dead, but they were also looking for living gold. Despite the earlier execution order, many high-ranking prisoners had survived, including the Duke of Orleans, who was found pinned under a pile of corpses, still breathing. These men were the keys to the kingdom. Their ransoms would fund the English crown for decades. The archers, meanwhile, moved among the fallen, stripping the rich silks and silver-mounted belts from the dead. It was a harvest of a different kind. A man who had started the day as a starving peasant from the Welsh borders might end it with enough gold tucked into his boot to buy a farm back home. But the atmosphere was not one of celebration. It was one of stunned silence. The English were too tired to cheer. They were still in enemy territory, miles from the safety of Calais, with a mountain of prisoners to manage and a long march still ahead of them. Henry ordered the army to move a short distance away to the village of Maisoncelles for the night. They left the field to the crows and the local villagers, who would soon descend like vultures to strip what the soldiers had missed. As the English campfires began to twinkle in the dark, the rain started again, a soft, persistent drizzle that seemed to want to wash the earth clean of what had happened. That night, Henry dined with the highest-ranking French prisoners, including the Duke of Orléans. It was a scene of surreal medieval etiquette, the victor serving the vanquished at a table set in a humble village house, discussing the will of God and the fortune of war, while thousands of their men lay unburied a mile away. Henry remained sombre, refusing to boast, attributing the victory entirely to divine intervention. He knew that Agincourt was a miracle, but he also knew that miracles are fleeting. He had humiliated France, but he had not yet conquered it. The march to Calais would resume at dawn, and though the road was now open, the weight of the victory felt almost as heavy as the threat of defeat. The hungry king had finally eaten, but the taste in his mouth was the iron of blood and the cold salt of the sea. The morning after the slaughter, the valley of Agincourt was a landscape of a different world, one where the silence was so profound it felt like a physical weight. The mist had returned, thick and white, curling around the legs of the horses and the mounds of the dead, as if trying to hide the shame of the previous day from the rising sun. For the English, the dawn brought a harsh clarity. The adrenaline that had turned starving archers into giants was gone, replaced by the reality of their own battered bodies. There is a quiet human truth in the way a soldier moves after a battle like this, not with the stride of glory, but with the stiff, gingerly movements of a man whose every muscle has been pushed to the point of structural failure. They were covered in a crust of dried mud and blood that had turned their tunics into stiff boards, and the smell, the metallic cloying scent of the field, clung to their skin like a second shadow. Henry V, however, was not a man for lingering. While he was deeply pious and spent the early hours in prayer, he was also a cold-eyed realist. He knew that the French, though humiliated, were still in their own country. The 3rd Division of the French army, which had fled without fighting, was still out there somewhere in the woods of Picardy, and the local peasantry was likely sharpening their farm tools. The English army was a small, fragile vessel carrying a treasure of captured dukes and counts that was worth more than the entire English treasury. He ordered the army to form up. There would be no grand monuments built on the field, no lingering to bury the French dead. The English gathered their own fallen of high rank, but the thousands of Frenchmen were left to the elements and the mercy of the local clergy. The march to Calais had to resume immediately. They were still 100 miles from home, and they were walking on a knife's edge. The march north was a surreal procession. Imagine the column, a few thousand ragged English soldiers, many still limping or nursing wounds, wrapped in dirty linen, guarding nearly 2,000 French prisoners. The social hierarchy of Europe was walking in the mud. The Duke of Orléans, one of the most powerful men in the world and a renowned poet, walked alongside common English archers who, only weeks before, would not have been allowed to look him in the eye. There is a soft, ironic humour in the logistical reality of this journey. The English archers, now wealthy beyond their wildest dreams, with looted jewellery and armour, were so tired they were reportedly trading gold rings for a loaf of bread or a drink of clean water. Wealth is a relative thing. when your stomach is empty and your feet are bleeding. As they moved toward the coast, the news of the victory travelled ahead of them like a wildfire. The miracle of Agincourt began to grow in the telling even before Henry reached the sea. To the English, it was proof of divine favour. To the French, it was a cataclysm that defied logic. The French government in Paris was in a state of total collapse, with the constable dead and the king still trapped in his glass delusions. There was no one to coordinate a counterattack. The English march, which had begun as a desperate flight, was now a victory lap through a graveyard. Yet Henry maintained the same iron discipline he had enforced since Harfleur. He forbade his men from gloating or mistreating the noble prisoners. He wanted to return to England not as a raider, but as a legitimate king who had conducted a just war and won by the hand of God. By the time the salt air of the English Channel began to bite at their faces, the army was at the end of its strength. When they finally saw the walls of Calais, the English stronghold on the French coast, many men reportedly broke down and wept. And they had survived the siege, the dysentery, the long march, the river crossing, and the greatest battle of their age. In Calais, the garrison and the citizens turned out in a frenzy of joy. But there was a final, bitter irony waiting for the common soldiers. The town was so overcrowded and supplies were so low that the price of food skyrocketed. Many of the archers who had survived the French army found themselves starving in an English town, unable to afford a meal despite the looted silver in their pockets. It was a harsh reminder that for the common man, war is a business where the profits are often eaten by the overhead. Henry stayed in Calais only long enough to organise the transport of the high-ranking prisoners. He knew the value of these men, not just in gold, but as political hostages. The Duke of Orleans would remain a prisoner in England for 25 years, becoming one of the most famous captives in history. For Henry, the prisoners were the living proof of his claim to France. On November 16th, the king finally set sail for England. The crossing was notoriously rough. The Channel, as if angry that the war was leaving its shores, tossed the ships with such violence that many of the French prisoners who had survived the arrows and the mud of Agincourt feared they would drown in the hold of an English ship. The arrival in London was a spectacle that the city would remember for centuries. Henry did not enter as a conqueror, seeking a triumph in the Roman style. He entered as a humble servant of God. He forbade the singing of songs that praised him personally, insisting instead on the Te Deum and songs of praise to the Almighty. The streets were hung with tapestries, and the conduits ran with wine, a medieval party of the highest order. But beneath the celebration, the hungry king was already looking back across the water. Agincourt had given him the prestige, the prisoners, and the breathing room he needed, but it had not won him the crown of France. It had merely been the opening move in a much longer, darker game. Darker. The humiliation of France was complete, but the conquest was just beginning. The archers went back to their villages, their stories growing taller with every pint of ale, while the king sat once again in Westminster, his eyes fixed on the map, the hollow crown now feeling a little more solid upon his brow. The shadow of Agincourt did not dissipate once the English ships vanished into the morning fog of the Channel. Instead, it lengthened across the heart of France, a cold and suffocating shroud. While London was a riot of colour and wine, Paris was a city of ghosts. Historians still argue whether the internal collapse of France following the battle was a result of the military loss or the psychological vacuum left by the death of so many leaders. With the Constable d'Albret dead and the most powerful dukes in English chains, the French government became a ship without a rudder, caught in a storm of its own making. The civil war between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, which had briefly paused to face the English, flared up with a renewed cannibalistic ferocity. They blamed each other for the disaster in the mud, and in doing so, they ensured that the humiliation of Agincourt would be a permanent scar rather than a temporary wound. For the common people of France, the aftermath was a slow-motion tragedy. The English had left, but they had left a void. The écorcheurs, or flayers, bands of demobilized soldiers and brigands, roamed the countryside like wolves, preying on the villages that the nobility could no longer protect. There is a soft, bitter irony in the fact that the very knights who had marched to Agincourt to defend their honour had, in their failure, stripped their own people of any safety. The glass king, Charles de Sussex, remained in his palace, his mind a fractured mirror, unaware that his kingdom was being partitioned by his own relatives and a young king across the sea. The victory at Agincourt had proved that the French feudal system was a hollow shell, a structure of immense beauty that collapsed the moment it was struck by a peasant's arrow. In England, the battle was being forged into a foundation of national identity. This was the era when the English language began to truly displace French as the tongue of the court and the law. Henry V used the victory to cement his legitimacy, claiming that the miracle of Agincourt was God's own signature on his right to rule. The longbow, once just a tool of the hunt and the border skirmish, became a symbol of English exceptionalism. We must remember that while the nobility provided the leadership, it was the common archer who had stood in the mud and shattered the elite of Europe. This realization began to shift the social tectonic plates of England. The yeoman was no longer just a servant, but a pillar of the state. But Henry V was not content to be a legendary ghost. He spent the years following 1415 preparing for a methodical, permanent conquest. He had learned from Agincourt that chevauchés, the fast, destructive raids, were not enough to hold a kingdom. He returned to France in 1417 with a different kind of army, one equipped for a long, grinding occupation. He took Normandy town by town, castle by castle. The glory of the open field was replaced by the dust of the siege and the ledger of the administrator. He was no longer a raider. He was a king moving into his new house, changing the locks as he went. The story of Agincourt often ends with the trumpet blast on the field, but its true conclusion was the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. In a stunning reversal of fortune, the Glass King was forced to disinherit his own son, the Dauphin, and name Henry V as his heir. Henry married the Princess Catherine, the very woman he had demanded before the war, uniting the two crowns in a fragile, blood-stained peace. For a brief moment it seemed that the English king had won it all. The humiliation of France was so complete that the King of England was now legally the King of France in waiting. It was the absolute peak of the House of Lancaster, a moment where the hollow crown was filled with the weight of two empires. Yet, history is a fickle narrator. In 1422, at the age of only 35, Henry V died, not by the sword, but by the same enemy that had haunted him at Harfleur, dysentery. He died just weeks before he would have officially become the King of France upon the death of Charles VI. He left behind a 9-month-old son, a fractured kingdom, and a legacy that was almost too large for his successors to carry. The mirror of all Christian kings was gone, and the empire he had built on the mud of Agincourt began to crumble. Within a generation, a young girl from Domremy, Joan of Arc, would rise to undo everything Henry had achieved, turning the humiliation of France into a new kind of holy fire. Agincourt remains a study in the fragility of power and the permanence of myth. Historians still argue whether the battle was a decisive turning point or merely a magnificent bloody detour in a war that England was destined to lose. But the myth versus fact intrigue is what keeps the story alive in our dreams. We remember the few, the band of brothers, and the arrows that darkened the sun. We forget the smell of the dysentery tents and the screams of the prisoners in the mud. We choose the poetry over the ledger because the poetry allows us to believe that against impossible odds, a starving man with a piece of wood can change the world. As we look back through the mists of 6 centuries, the figures on the field of Agincourt become silhouettes. We see the king with his dented crown, the archer with his calloused hands, and the French knight drowning in his own magnificence. They are all gone now, their armour rusted to nothing, their names mostly forgotten. The field itself is a quiet place of wheat and wind, showing no scars of the thousands who fell there. Only the story remains, whispered like moonlight, a reminder that the loudest moments in history often happen in the quietest, muddiest places. The memory of Agincourt did not merely sit in the chronicles, it became a living, breathing ghost that haunted the halls of the Louvre and the towers of Windsor alike. As the decades rolled forward after Henry's death, the battle transitioned from a military event into a philosophical anchor. It became the ultimate proof that the old world of high-born chivalry was a brittle thing when faced with the cold, industrial efficiency of the common man. Historians still argue whether the decline of the knight was a slow erosion or a sudden collapse, but Agincourt was undoubtedly the moment the foundation cracked. The French nobility, having lost their fathers and uncles in the mud of Picardy, grew up with a different kind of steel in their souls, a realization that honour without tactical wisdom was merely a fancy way to die. In the villages of England, the veterans of 1415 became local legends, men who had seen the Glass King's lands and returned with silver groats and tales of a sky that turned black with arrows. There's a soft domestic humour in the thought of these men back in their cottages, trying to explain to their neighbours why they didn't just take the Frenchmen's horses. The neighbours didn't understand the suction of Picardy clay, which could hold a horse as firmly as a stone wall. These veterans were the first national heroes in a sense that transcended local lords. They belonged to the king, and the king belonged to the story. The longbow itself was mandated by law for practice on Sundays, ensuring that every village green in England remained a training ground for the next Agincourt, a policy that kept the English military machine humming long after the man who started it was in his tomb. As we drift further into the twilight of the 15th century, the geopolitical reality began to shift in ways Henry the Massive could never have predicted. The humiliation of France acted as a paradoxical fertilizer. It forced the French crown to modernize. To defeat the English, they eventually had to centralize their power, create a professional standing army, and embrace the very gunpowder that Henry had used at Harfleur. By the time the 100 Years' War finally sputtered to a close in 1453, the French had regained almost everything Henry had taken. They had learned the hard way that a kingdom cannot be defended by egos and heraldry alone. The lesson in humility had, over 40 years, turned into a curriculum for a superpower. Yet, for all the shifting borders, the emotional resonance of Agincourt stayed frozen in time. It became a shorthand for the underdog. Every time a small, exhausted force faced a glittering host, the ghosts of 1415 were summoned. It is a story that feels human because it is a story of vulnerability. We see ourselves not in the Duke of Orleans in his golden armour, but in the archer shivering in the rain, wondering if he'll ever see the apple orchards of Kent again. It is the victory of the common over the elite, the practical over the ornamental. It reminds us that history is not always written by the people with the most money or the longest titles, but by those who can stand their ground when the mud is rising to their knees. The myth versus fact intrigue continues to bubble even today. Was the field really as narrow as they say? Modern terrain analysis suggests it was, a natural bottleneck that turned a numerical advantage into a death trap. Were the arrows really that effective? Ballistic tests show that at close range, a bodkin point arrow could indeed find the weak spots in even the best Milanese steel. But the most important fact of Agincourt isn't a measurement or a weight. It's the feeling of that morning, the smell of the wet earth, the sound of the wind through the trees, and the terrifying, beautiful silence before the first volley was released. That is the truth that survives the centuries. As the candle of the medieval era began to flicker out, replaced by the bright, harsh light of the Renaissance, Agincourt remained a flickering flame in the English imagination. It was a moment of perfect clarity in a muddy world. It taught us that arrogance is a heavy burden to carry into a fight, and that a little bit of wood and a lot of heart can sometimes move a mountain, or at least an army. The hungry king and his band of brothers have left the stage, but the theatre they built remains, a quiet valley in France, where the wind still whispers of St. Crispin's Day and the day the world changed its mind about who was truly invincible. The final hours of the battle did not bring a sudden peace, but a slow, heavy descent into the reality of what had been done. As the sun began to sink, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley of Agincourt, the landscape was no longer a field of wheat, but a testament to the fragility of human ambition. The chivalry that had arrived in the morning with such glittering confidence was now a literal carpet of steel and silk crushed into the Picardy clay. Historians still argue whether the massacre of the prisoners was the true end of the Middle Ages, the precise moment when the romantic ideals of knightly combat were discarded in favour of total war. To the English soldiers, however, the philosophy mattered less than the weight of their own limbs. They were men who had been pushed beyond the limits of biological endurance, and as the adrenaline of the St. Crispin's Day fever broke, they were left with a hollow, ringing silence in their ears. The physical aftermath was a logistical nightmare that mirrored the chaos of the battle itself. Henry IV, ever the disciplined administrator, ordered the field to be searched not just for his own dead, but for those of high rank who might still be breathing beneath the piles. This was the dark, visceral labour of the victory, men with the lanterns moving through the darkening mist, turning over bodies that were cold to the touch, listening for a groan or the clink of a moving gauntlet. They found the Duke of Orleans, pinned by the weight of his own horse and the bodies of his cousins, a living treasure amidst a mountain of corpses. There's a soft, grim humour in the accounts of the English archers during this time. They were reportedly so laden with looted jewellery and silver-hilted swords that they walked with a jingle, yet they would have traded it all for a single dry crust of bread. The wealth of France was in their hands, but the hunger of England was still in their bellies. In the French camp, which had been so full of music and gambling the night before, there was only a void. The servants and camp followers had fled, taking what they could, leaving behind tents filled with fine wine and silks that the English would soon fall upon. The French nation had been decapitated. It wasn't just a loss of men, it was a loss of the very structure of their society. The constable was dead, the admiral was dead, and the master of crossbowmen was dead. The glass king in Paris would soon receive the news, and it is said that even in his madness, the weight of the disaster seemed to press upon him. France was now a body without a head, and the English goddams, whom they had mocked as starving prey, were now the masters of the road. Henry V spent the night in the small village of Maisoncelles, surrounded by his band of brothers. He was a king who had won a miracle, yet he remained characteristically sombre. He knew that the victory was a fragile thing, a temporary reprieve from the crushing weight of his own ambition. He had humiliated the greatest power in Europe, but he was still 100 miles from safety. The miracle of Agincourt had given him a legend, but it had not yet given him a crown. As he sat in the dim light of a village house, his armour finally removed, the scars on his face hidden by the shadows, he must have known that he had changed the world. He had proven that a small, disciplined force of commoners could shatter the elite of the world, and in doing so, he had signalled the beginning of the end for the world into which he had been born. The return to the coast was a funeral march for the French and a pilgrimage of exhaustion for the English. They moved north through a country that was too stunned to resist them. The local people watched from the edges of the woods, seeing the long line of noble prisoners walking in the mud, their heads bowed, their colourful surcoats stained with the earth of their own kingdom. It was a visual reversal of the natural order. The archers, those village boys with their yew-bows and calloused hands, were now the masters of dukes. This social upheaval was perhaps the most lasting humiliation of all. Agincourt proved that armour could be pierced, that blood could be spilled, and that the will of God did not always favour the person with the most ancestors. As we look back at this moment from the comfort of the future, we see the battle as a clean, cinematic event, but for the men in the mud, it was a messy, terrifying, and profoundly human struggle. The myth versus fact of Agincourt is a dance between the poetry of Shakespeare and the reality of the ledger. The fact is that thousands died in a field because of a legal argument. The myth is that they died for something much grander. Both are true. The humility of France was a political reality, but the glory of England was a psychological necessity for a young king trying to prove he belonged on a throne his father had stolen. The sun set on Agincourt, but the heat of that day would continue to warm the English imagination for 6 centuries, a flickering candle in the long, cold night of history. The morning after a miracle is often more exhausting than the miracle itself. As the grey, watery light of October 26th touched the field of Agincourt, it revealed a landscape that had been stripped of all its medieval pretense. The flower of France was no longer a poetic metaphor. It was a literal, physical obstacle of cold steel and stiffening limbs. The English army, now preparing to move out, was a collection of walking contradictions. Men who were technically the wealthiest peasants in Europe, laden with the golden chains and jewelled daggers of the French nobility, yet who were so hungry they were gnawing on raw cabbage found in the village gardens. Historians still argue whether Henry's haste to leave the field was a tactical error that prevented him from seizing even more territory. But to the king, the calculation was simple. He had a prize in his hand, and the longer he stood still, the more likely he was to drop it. The task of clearing the field of the English dead was a sombre, intimate affair. Unlike the French, who were left in great communal pits or to the care of local priests, the English dead of high rank were treated with a grim, practical reverence. Since there was no way to transport the bodies of the Duke of York and the Earl of Suffolk back to England in the autumn heat, their remains were boiled, a common, if gruesome, medieval practice to separate the flesh from the bone. The bones were then packed in lead to be carried home, while the hearts were buried in the soil of the land they had died to reclaim. This sensory detail, the smell of the bubbling vats, and the steam rising in the cold morning air, grounds the epic in the visceral reality of 15th century warfare. It was a world where a duke could be reduced to a collection of clean bones in a box before his king had even reached the coast. As the column began the final leg toward Calais, the prisoners became the primary focus of the army's energy. The Duke of Orleans, young, wealthy, and shell-shocked, rode near the king, a living insurance policy against a French counterattack. There is a soft observational humour in the chronicles of this march. It is noted that the English archers despite their earlier execution of the lower-ranking captives, were now treating the surviving High Lords with a sort of bewildered respect, as if they couldn't quite believe they were responsible for the fall of such magnificent creatures. The archers had spent their lives being told these men were chosen by God to rule. Now, they were the ones holding the lead ropes of the Lord's horses. The natural order of the world had not just been bent, it had been snapped like a dry yew branch. The march through the territory of the Count of St. Paul was a tense, silent affair. The English were moving through a land that had not yet been fully bled, and the threat of an ambush from the local garrisons remained high. Henry maintained a pace that was punishing for his wounded men. He knew that the news of the defeat would cause a momentary paralysis in the French administration, but that paralysis would not last forever. He needed the walls of Calais. By the time the army reached the English Pale, the thin strip of land around the port city that England had held since the days of Edward III, the soldiers were little more than ghosts in rags. When they finally saw the English flag flying over the city gates, the relief was so profound that many men reportedly sat down in the mud and refused to move another inch until they were carried. In Calais, the victory was met with a mixture of religious awe and mercantile opportunism. While the bells of the churches rang out the Te Deum, the merchants of the city were busy raising the prices of bread and ale to take advantage of the soldiers' looted wealth. It is a cynical truth of history that the men who survived the arrows and the mud of Agincourt were nearly bankrupted by their own countrymen before they could sail home. Henry, ever the image-conscious monarch, spent his time in Calais organising the shipping of his noble guests. These prisoners were the real fruit of the campaign. They were not just men. They were the future of French politics, held in a gilded cage. As the ships were readied, Henry looked back toward the south. He had won the battle, and he had humiliated the kingdom, but as he watched the grey waves of the Channel, he knew that Agincourt was merely the end of the beginning. The hollow crown was now a heavy crown, weighted with the responsibility of a conquest that would take the rest of his short, brilliant life to pursue. The return to England was not merely a homecoming, it was a transformation. As the ships crossed the churning grey of the Channel in November 1415, the men on board were no longer just soldiers of the crown, they were the architects of a new national myth. When Henry V's ship touched the shingle at Dover, the enthusiasm of the people was so great that men waded waist-deep into the freezing surf to carry the king ashore on their shoulders, as if he were a holy relic. This was the moment the humiliation of France became the glory of England, a transition from a bloody reality to a shimmering legend that would be polished by every generation to come. Historians still argue whether the English public truly understood the cost of the victory, but in the delirium of the moment, the thousands of lives lost to dysentery and the dark stain of the executed prisoners were forgotten, replaced by the image of the Son of York and the Lions of England standing triumphant over the lilies of the Valois. In London, the celebration reached a fever pitch that the city had not seen in a century. The king, true to his severe and pious nature, refused to allow a triumphal arch to be built in his own honour, insisting that all praise be directed to God. Yet the city itself became a stage. At London Bridge, huge effigies of giants stood guard, holding the keys to the city, while at Cornhill the conduits ran with sweet wine, and children dressed as angels sang from wooden pavilions. Henry rode through the streets in a simple gown of purple, his face grave, his dented helmet carried before him by a squire so that the people could see the physical proof of his peril. There is a soft human humour in the accounts of the common archers who returned to their villages. They were the celebrities of their day, often found in taverns, showing off a French ring or a silver buckle, their stories growing more elaborate with every pint of ale, until it seemed as if they had each personally fought off 20 French dukes in the mud. But beneath the surface of the parades and the tapestries, the long-term reality of Agincourt was beginning to set in. The battle had not ended the war. It had merely reset the terms. Henry used the prestige of the victory to secure massive loans from Parliament, allowing him to build a professional navy and a permanent administrative structure in Normandy. The lesson in humility he had taught the French nobility forced them to eventually modernise their own state, creating a centralised monarchy that would one day expel the English for good. Agincourt was a magnificent, violent pivot point, the last great gasp of the medieval world and the first loud drumbeat of the early modern era. It proved that the individual skill of a well-trained commoner was more than a match for the inherited status of an armoured aristocrat, a realisation that would slowly unravel the very fabric of the feudal system. As the years passed and the veterans of 1415 grew old, the battle passed from living memory into the realm of the poets. Shakespeare would eventually give it a voice that resonated through the centuries, turning the goddams into a band of brothers. But the true legacy of Agincourt is found in the quiet fields of Picardy, where the wheat grows tall and the wind still carries the ghost of a hiss. It is a story that reminds us of the fragility of power and the strength of the desperate. It tells us that history is not a straight line of inevitable progress, but a series of moments where the weather, the mud, and the heart of a king can collide to change the world forever. The hungry king is long gone, his bones resting in Westminster Abbey, but the echo of his arrows still vibrates in the air of every narrow field where an underdog stands to face a giant. The story of Agincourt is now coming to its rest, much like the men who stood in that mud so long ago. Close your eyes and let the sounds of the battle fade. The whistling of the arrows, the clatter of the steel, the heavy breathing of the horses, all of it dissolving into the soft rhythmic patter of rain on a distant roof. The cold air of France is replaced by the warmth of your own bed, and the shadows of the past are now just the gentle flickers of a dream. You are safe, you are warm, and the long march is over. The king has returned home, the archers have found their peace, and the field is quiet once again. Let your mind drift like the mist over the Somme, light and unburdened, as the weight of history softens into the velvet dark of sleep. The world of 1415 is far away now, a shimmering memory in the sea of time. Rest now. The vigil is over. The dawn will come when it is ready. But for now there is only the silence of the stars and the deep, restorative pull of the night. Sweet dreams.